Welcome to the next episode in our continuing dialogue on rethinking religion. I'm joined once again by the illustrious John Vervaeke and by some dubious rando, Layman Pascal. When we left off last time, we said that there were several themes that we wanted to return to and just give a little bit more attention. And so first, just to focus back on the meta crisis and including the meaning crisis and the threat of systemic collapse that we're all feeling, and to resituate our dialogue and our respective spiritual projects in relationship to that. Also to connect our reflections on grieving for the death of God, which some people, they might still find it to be an abstract exercise, to the much more immediately relatable and accessible grieving for the state of the world.
Yes.
And we also touched on the tyranny of the propositional and suggested that grieving for the state of the world might involve, some significant recognition of the impact of that epistemological hegemony on our culture. So I'm going to do a much briefer intro this time than last time, but just to start, I wanted to mention a recent Voices with Vervaeke video that I watched that I think is relevant. And this was the conversation that you had with Ken Lowry, John.
Yes.
Yeah, especially around his response to the theological and existential challenge that you'd posed him. And that was, if we consider the story about Christ's exclamation from the cross, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Can we take that seriously? Can we really take that in and take that on and try to understand what was going on in that moment and not have it seriously challenge or even undermine some very basic theological points of Christianity? So I was impressed with Ken's response to that, which was not to provide any, propositional or apologetic responses, but really just to let the question work on him and burn through him, somewhat like a koan. I think you mentioned koan, John.
Yeah.
And he let it undo a number of his presuppositions, a number of his structures, and really open him up to new relationship to himself and to what matters and to the good and the true and the beautiful. So I thought that was a really great conversation. And I was also personally excited. I learned that the name of his YouTube channel is Climbing on Mount Sophia. And Mount Sophia is a really central image or metaphor in my own integral grammatology. So I thought that was really cool. But anyway, I mentioned, the episode here because Christ's cry from the cross is emblematic of the question that we've been exploring in this series, just in our dialogue together. And that's the anguish and grief of the absenting of the felt presence of God. And we've been saying culturally, we need to really pause here and in this moment of absence and let that and the feelings that attend it really work on us. But of course, we're confronted right now not only with the centuries-old loss of our mythic center, but also imminently with domicide, the threat of domicide, the loss of our living context. And so I read a few days ago about how William Shatner, when he went up to space, he started crying, and he was really shocked by the amount of grief he felt when he looked down at the vulnerable bubble of the earth and out at the very cold, what he even felt was an ugly darkness of space. It just really struck him how vulnerable we are, how precious we are, how at risk we are. And so whatever else religion is, I think it must be something that prepares us, equips us to respond to this moment and this confrontation. And so there's a lot to say about that. I think we've approached it in a number of ways, and I think we were feeling maybe my own reading of our end of our last conversation was that this is something that after we've built up the momentum and laid a lot of groundwork in our conversation, this was something that would be fruitful for us to return to. So I want to now hand this over to you guys for whatever you'd like to share or to suspend in our middle here.
Yeah, that conversation with Ken was powerful. I was grateful for all the comments. I want to make that clear. Nobody, there was maybe one troll comment or something like that. All of them were thoughtful. I was surprised by the number of people that replied to it as a koan, as something to really, as you said, like burn through presuppositions, open up. I mean, there was a lot of, and I don't mean thoughtless, they were thoughtful, but there was a lot of what answers I expected, where people were bringing in some theological machinery to try and repair any, no, this is all, there's no problem here. And I don't disparage that, people should make the arguments they feel are pertinent or relevant. I'm not being dismissive or disregarding that, but I was impressed. I expected that. I mean, that's to be expected, but there was more of the koanic responses than I had expected, which means I think that, and that conversation sort of took off a bit. So it struck a nerve in some way that it is ponderous to me. I'd like to, like what you're suggesting, Bruce, I'd like to slow down and think about how that is deeply resonating with people, that there seems to be a lot of people, even within the legacy religions. The one that's most pertinent right now is, because of Ken, is Christianity, but I don't think it's limited to Christianity, who are experiencing their religion more, I don't know, more as a question, I think I want to put it, than as an answer. They somehow, and this was the other interesting thing about Ken. This is oversimplifying, but just for the sake of moving the conversation, he basically is reinterpreting Christianity as a questioning, a questioning and questing. And that's sort of his primary response. And I found that very, very, very interesting. And I see more and more people doing that. I got that strong sense also at the Consciousness and Conscience conference in Thunder Bay. And I'm wondering what that means. And I'm wondering how much the legacy religions can undergo that transformation. I suppose I'm posing a question to the questioning, and I'll just state it now. Is this transformation of religion from a set of answers to koanic, parabolic questioning, the kairos that we've been looking for as we've been trying to rethink religion? This is how religion is properly responding? Because the thing about that is it touches both on grief and wonder when you're in that mode. Because when you grieve, we've all been through grief. You get this profound questioning that comes up if you don't get stuck. But of course, it also that questioning can also lead to wonder, which we've also invoked. So it would be a symbolon of co-activating and coalescing the grieving and the wondering that I think we've many times thought are central to what's going on right now. So that's a question I'm posing.
Yeah, I think there's something, I mean, it demands a lot of people to approach these things in the mode of a questioning that doesn't undermine their ability to act and regulate themselves.
Yes.
However, there's also something about questioning that strikes me as having a future orientation, right? The future is out there, never arrives. It's always an unknown. And that reminds me of, say, a Teilhard de Chardin kind of Christianity, where we look to the unknown future as the site of the God that might redeem us from the domicide. And so I associate that with the feeling I have that something like preparedness could be a general orienting principle for religion going forward, because it has this element, on the one hand, this esoteric element of preparedness, which is we don't know what we're preparing for. It's unknown, it's strange, and we have to stand in front of it. But on the other hand, there's this social organization element, this social ethic that's a big part of religion, which is we all have to do something together. And what we have to do together is organize society in a way that faces the disruption, faces the weird, faces the emotional challenge we're all going through, faces the real risks. So when I hear questioning, I mean, I can go down a koan route, which is where I usually like to go, but right now, emotionally, I'm thinking of it as a simultaneously esoteric and exoteric way of looking toward the unknown future that we're all facing. And it may be that the way we've treated religion in the past was too much of an inheritance, too much of a history, and not enough of a future. Because what we all stand before in terms of the possibly our own collective sabotage of the life world is something imminent, something that's just in front of us all the time. So we may need to reverse the temporal polarization that underlies our religious assumptions.
I think that's a good reframing, even reformulation. The future orientation rather than a past orientation. I think there's something deep there. I'm trying to get at what I've been very critical of the legacy religions because they seem in many ways, I don't mean individually, I mean collectively as institutions. I don't mean individuals, but as institutions, they're not really dealing with many of the factors around the meaning crisis or the meta crisis. They're not saying anything about AI, which has the capacity to radically transform our understanding of humanity and personhood. It seems to me the most theologically pregnant thing right now, and look around and try to find anybody talking about it in any significant degree. Very hard to find. And that, for me, Layman, is an exact instance of precisely what you're talking about, right? We're looking back instead of, no, what's in front of us. And this is just, I'm just picking this. This is not exhaustive. I'm just picking this as an example. But here's something in front of us that is profoundly theologically pressing. I'm using theological very broadly here, right? And very little discussion or reflection upon it. And for me, that is a not taking a future orientation in a really, really important way. Does that land with you as something resonant with what you just said?
Yeah, I think it absolutely does, because we have all these maybe omens of the disruptive potential of the future. Some of them are catastrophic and tragic that we may have to approach through a grief that we have to sit with as an open question. Yeah. Some of them are just profoundly unknown, unpredictable, and really weird. We already see a society bubbling up full of weirdness. And we can't really, from our waking state, rational left brain propositional knowledge, anticipate correctly what any of these emerging phenomena are going to do to everything that we hold dear. And AI is an excellent example of something whose capacity to reconfigure our lives is something that we cannot track properly and we stand in front of like a question. And unless the religious orientation takes that seriously as the moment of faith, unless it turns to some degree, there's so much inheritance that's beautiful and important and should give us the strength to do that. But it only counts if it actually gives us the strength to do that and puts us in front of the question mark that stands before us.
Yeah, I relate to a lot of this. I think a couple things I can think at the same time. One is, Derrida, he pointed us in that direction with his notion of the messianic, not as the Messiah that's coming going to save everybody, but basically that hovering horizon that's always calling us into our next becoming. and in that promise that shapes how things unfold. And but it's in the not arriving that's actually generative in a way. And you could connect that to Heidegger or to my own practice tradition of the time-space knowledge, where they talk about living in the future infinitive. And it's again, it's an orientation of the generativity of the future, of the responsiveness of our own being towards meeting that open question. And it's an ongoing. That's one of the things that Ken pointed out in his conversation that I liked and that I relate to from my other orientations, which is that, a question has the ability to cut through what's already decided and to open you up into more immediately contactable connection with what's presenting, and letting that do its work, letting that be ontogenetic in a sense. So that's one thing. And then in my own experience, I relate to some of John's background. I tried out for a while a Christian path, and I had some good experiences, but like John, I also had some traumatic experiences, and I ultimately ended up leaving legacy religion behind. But I went through a period of time when I was in Asia, and especially deeply at the Krishnamurti Center in India, where I had let go of all traditional religion and orientation, and in fact, disparaged it to some degree. And I really, really focused just on what I can understand about consciousness and self and perception and experience and wholeness and all of that. And I tried to do much more phenomenological, hermeneutic approach that was just immediately engaged. And I did have some beautiful experiences, some mystical experiences, some breakthrough insights that have changed me. But at the far end of that, I also found myself actually hungry for these human streams of wisdom and experience. And it wasn't to return to them for answers. It was to be part of that ongoing evolutionary unfolding human dialogue. And to really be able to participate in that, to listen to that, to be nourished by that, to be participating in whatever is unfolding, each in our small ripple-like ways. That really called to me, as I didn't need to bracket those things out as total mistakes. That there is a lot of genuine insight and beauty and wisdom bubbling through that long historical narrative. And I just found myself in a place of wanting to situate myself in that again, in a listening, engaged posture, not a propositional one, not one that's looking for surety, but that's appreciating and savoring. Because I could now, from my own deep diving in existential questions myself, see so much of that reflected through all those narratives that it was just re-enlivening for me.
So I'm wondering then, is that let's say it's a real possibility. Let's just make a supposition. Suppose it is a real possibility that this kairos metanoia within the legacy religions is possible. What does that look like? Does that mean that there's a foreground backgrounding shift? Something like wisdom, the cultivation of wisdom, which is what we need right now, most pressingly, is more important than worship. I mean, you can sort of look at various religions as to which they foreground and which they background. And the God religions, at least the Abrahamic ones, they do talk a lot about wisdom, but they have tended to foreground worship as the primary thing one does. That being a servant of God is the primary job of the religious person? Does it mean that that's flipping and what now it is, right? And I'm still trying to connect this to Jesus's exclamation on the cross. Like, what's happening to him there? What does that mean for us? What does the sense of God-forsakenness mean? I mean, God-forsakenness plausibly undermines the prioritization of worship in some fashion. But because he's actually asking a question, which is really pivotal. I mean, and many people, wrote in, the psalm he's quoting from is actually a triumphant psalm. It's like, I wouldn't hang too much on that, because I think that's to undermine the depth of his experience. It's one of the few things we have that might literally go back to him, because it's in Aramaic. It's very challenging to Christian theology, right? So it's plausible that it's real. The reason it was kept is because it was undeniable. That's not a deductive argument, but it's a good historical argument. Is that moment the moment where that inversion is actually happening, where the quest for a more profounder understanding is being prioritized over the sense of, I don't know what to call it, that contracted covenant, better word, that covenantal relationship with God? That's the word I want, not contract. Contract is the wrong word. Throw that out. Right? Jesus seems to represent the culmination of the covenantal relationship. Human beings serve God in the right way. God cares for them, authors history for them. That covenantal relationship seems to be shattered at that moment. And is it now being replaced by this quest? And is the wisdom cultivation now being given prioritization? I'm asking this as a mythological event. Is the wisdom cultivation being given priority over the worship cultivation? It's a question. Again, I'm asking the two of you.
The way I would think about it is that the performance of worship is a subset of a wisdom culture, but it has to be understood or tweaked in a certain way so that it fits into that a little bit more nicely. Because sacred worship is a performance. It's a mode of attunement that has real benefits for the physiology and the brain and the community. So we don't want to lose that. But there is a question about how we conceive that toward which we are entered into the mode of worship.
Right.
And one of the things you might do mythologically with the moment of Christ's questioning is to consider that as a moment of transfiguration in his understanding of the God that he is embodying, right? Yes. That he's embodying God as a certainty. And now he understands something more deeply in his moment of transfiguration to the truly divine human synthesis that he represents. He's understanding the question of faith as built into the substance of God itself, right? So that he's not saying, God has forsaken me, or I somehow don't understand. He's saying, I recognize now that my lack of understanding is inherent to what God is, that the uncertainty and that the gap is within the divine itself. And therefore we can relate to that. We can tell ourselves a story that we've gone one layer deeper in faith by worshiping that which has a question mark at its very heart. The question mark is not just our lack of understanding of an exclamation mark. It's our true relationship to a question mark. And therefore we can bring the mode of worship within the fold of a wisdom culture.
I definitely see what you're saying. And I think there is that prioritization of placing the question within the ground of being itself. So it becomes an opening, an inexhaustible, a generative, rather than a closure, a restful, a perfection notion of the sacred. And I'm wondering then, and I think it does, but maybe we can open it up for discussion, that opening notion of God carries with it the potential of profound pain. I mean, we don't want to remove the pain in his exclamation either. I mean, there's definitely question, but there's profound pain. That's why he uses the language of being forsaken. So when we think of how I'm trying to, it's pretentious to try and put yourself in the mind of Jesus on the cross. I get that, but I mean, but we're also called to do so. So I mean, doing that right is tricky. But when I think of the moments where I felt the most forsaken, those are precisely the moments when I feel the most disconnected. That's what I was trying to get at the loss of this covenantal relationship, right? That there was some kind of discontinuity introduced in that moment, and there's something painful about that. Is it just the pain of the transfiguration, or is the pain now the pain and the real possibility of profound disconnection, and now an ongoing part of the relationship with the sacred, for lack of a better word?
Well, this is where I would go to something like a non-dual mode of thinking, which is, to me, disconnection is also the site of connection, right? The separator is the connector kind of thing, right? So there's a sense in which you can have this initial experience of a relationship to the ground of being, which is seemingly the opposite of being disconnected from the ground of being.
Right.
But then there's a more profound connection, which is still present in the completeness of the disconnection. And that might be what is lived out in that moment. In that case, pain and suffering and loss and disconnect are a gesture of questioning that is still completely embedded in the nature of the divine, and in fact presents something about the nature of the divine in that moment. And I think we might find an echo of that in what I bring up a lot in this series. I think the sort of Reichian bodywork approach, which is that if you were going to create a civilization that was more open, more able to take the questioning as the kairos, then those bodies would have to be more able to withstand the sensations of the unknown and the unstable.
Right.
So they would have to have some idea that enables them to do that. They would have to think that this thing that feels to me to be the disconnect is actually the place in which I wish to be situated so that I can be connected.
Okay, so two things come up for me, and then I'll be quiet so Bruce can respond. One is, that seems to be a deepening of the very place of the crucifixion as the intersection point. So I think that's an insight to hold. And then I was thinking about what you said, and then it again takes us deeper into the grief motif. When you're with somebody, we've talked about this, when you're with somebody who's in grief, who's feeling forsaken, the social contract has been broken. That's what funerals are admitting. The social contract is broken. There's a gap, right? But if we put aside the attempt to just paper it over with propositions, right? Remember, we talked about this kind of profound connectedness that is possible between people because of their shared grief. And I think I told the story of the Buddha and the mustard seed, right? Or maybe Bruce told it. I can't remember who did. And so I'm just trying to explicate what I thought were two profound things that came out what you said. One is you're deepening the placement of the exclamation in the crucifixion by what you said, and you're also tying to the fact that grief has an enormous capacity to connect us through profound disconnection. So the social contract, the covenantal network breaks, but then we find in that profound loss a kind of deeper connection is possible to us. Does that land with what you said?
Very much so. And I think it's also very applicable to thinking the death of the world, so to speak, right?
Yes.
The people who feel that are together in front of that question and that pain.
Yes.
But Bruce.
Actually, I really feel what you're sharing here. And one of the ways that I remember reflecting on the cross, and I know I heard this in a number of places, but when I was Christian, the cross is kind of like the I crossed out. And of course, that's not in the tradition, but it's a way of relating to it, that it's not the I gone, it's the I crossed out, but remaining in the crossing out. There's a death in that. There's a letting go of that, of a certain kind of orientation and an opening to something else. And I think developmentally, when we're going from our embedment in the emotional field of the mother to discovering our existential aloneness, there's a cry that comes at that point. There's a feeling of abandonment. There's a sense of a deep loss of a participation in a relationship that was sustaining and defining. And that puts us in this reproachment mode, the terrible twos. But I don't mean to say that the cross is just that, but or the cry on the cross is just that, but to me it's an echo of that same kind of developmental movement where we move from the embedment of some kind of identity structure to the loss of that structure, to the feeling of grief and vulnerability and hollowness and even betrayal when we find those structures dissolve. But moving through grief, we have the possibility both to discover in ourselves other resources, and in that discovery to find a deeper mode of relationship with the world and being with the world that maybe goes underneath in some way that structure that was sustaining us before, but also builds something new. So I don't want to take the developmental thing too far in the analogy. It only works so far, but we have in a number of theological traditions, the cataphatic and the apophatic, and there's that confrontation with that darkness, with the dissolution of all known anchors. And I think that's a profound transitional moment. Jean-Luc Nancy points to Christianity as containing within itself and within its own mythos, its own self-deconstruction.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That it predicts in a sense its own undoing in the very dying of the God at its center, in order for there to be a new mode of being. In a sense, it presents the archetypal template for the very undoing of the structure that we take to be our God, which could be, the whole propositional construct.
That's so pertinent, Bruce. And then, of course, Jesus, even before the crucifixion, repeatedly gives parables and utterances around it being, you need to die in order to be born again. That's a constant theme. Unless the seed goes into the ground and dies, and that. So I mean, that is thematic, presumably, of what he was doing. But what you just articulated was explicitly talked about at some of the dinners at the Consciousness and Conscience conference. And Jonathan Pajot is actually, he skirts along the line, the boundaries of heresy with this, but he's so charming and brilliant that he's getting away with it so far. But he has said that he thinks that Christianity might itself be going through its own death and resurrection cycle. And this was now something that was taken up in discussion and this is by Christians. And I was privileged to be there, and they invited me to ask questions around it very welcomingly, in a very welcoming manner. But this proposal that just what you articulated might be what is being enacted right now, and that the momentum that was being felt at the conference, which a lot of people talked about, was at least in part the momentum of that moment. That what we're witnessing is the possibility, the real possibility, potency and act, the real possibility of the death and resurrection of Christianity in the face of the meaning crisis and the meta crisis. So I just want to let you know that that is not something. You're not the voice of one crying in the wilderness to keep the biblical metaphors going. That was something that was in the spirit of the conference. Now, I don't know what that means, but I thought I should just feed that back to you, that proposal is now, people are taking it up as an apt description of what is happening.
Go ahead, Bruce.
Okay, just one other thing I was remembering from that I really appreciated hearing about that, that's being felt. One of the things that I just remembered that also just came up this morning right before we turned on the cameras, which was my wife came into the room and was talking to me about her own tradition, which is the Hindu tradition. And she was saying that, the West says, our Puranas are myth. And, in a way that's true, but in a way, if it means that there's something not real there, then, they're missing something. But what she was wanting to say there is we get called idolatrous. She said we get called idolatrous because we have so many gods and we do these different kinds of things. But that if you are facing the sun and the sun is giving you so much, and there's nothing that you can give back to it, you can just make the gesture, holding up the jug, the water, right? That's this act of worship. And she's saying it's not worshiping the sun as an absolute being, but worshiping the sun as a source of life and sustenance that we can't meaningfully do anything back for except in symbolic form. And she says the whole world is full of such presences. And the whole life in her own tradition, she feels, is structured around the grateful, connecting acknowledgement of all of those elements. And so the reason I wanted to bring that up is I was thinking about Christ saying, what you do to the least of these, you are doing to me. And he's opening up, I think, this question and this possibility for people to relate to their world situation worshipfully and in love and in service. And maybe the problem of idolatry is not holding up any particular thing, but absolutizing that thing, to hold it in a way that fixes it and cuts you off from that way of relating to the miracle of the multiplicity of this world, right? And so that one answer to the golden calf is to strike it down and to say there can only be a relationship to the God who can't be named and represented. The other way to say it is this whole teeming thing is something that we can try to enter deeply into a respectful, worshipful relationship with. And the reason I wanted to just make that suggestion is to think about our overall orientation globally to the world, to how we've related to it, and to what we can do responsively to the multiple crises that are spreading through it, including ecologically.
There's a couple things I want to throw in to complicate this a little bit, but first I want to say that
How unusual to be, Layman.
How unusual of me, exactly. What a shock. This has scrambled everyone's predictive processing, I'm sure. That notion of the idol and the icon, and the notion of moving through forms to something greater than forms has to me a certain the quality of the gratefulness and the humanly healthy, satisfying capacity of that, I think, is really important. But we also need to be thinking about the open form pointing us towards something that itself is open and questionable. And to John's comment about the Pajot flirting with heresy, thinking about the death and rebirth in Christianity, I will say that whenever I was able to make time at dinner or lunch for people who were at the Consciousness and Conscience conference, first of all, I didn't hear much about conscience. But second of all, no offense to John, everybody was most excited about Pajot when I spoke to them.
Yes.
And I think that there's been a tradition in philosophy for the last couple of 100 years of foregrounding the negative, foregrounding the contradiction, and bringing that together with mythos is something that there is a tremendous hunger for, that people want and need to come into these ideas through mythic forms. But it would be great if those mythic forms were capable of presenting things that we see in advanced philosophy, that we see in new cognitive science and things like that. So I think that Pajot is standing in a very fertile position for a lot of people. So that's to the side. The things I want to throw in here are, first of all, that the crucified Savior strikes me as being a bit like the thing that our cognitive field throws up to us in every moment, right? That the discrepancy in our predictive processing stands out to us as the thing we have to deal with in our perceptual and cognitive field. And that's a bit like the central figure, the figure that promises something to us, is a strange contradictory figure. It's like a crucified Savior within the cognitive field of any moment. And staying with the discrepancy is sort of an inbuilt process of us trying to figure out how to renormalize our field in every moment. Mm-hmm. I think so. That's one way to read that myth. Another thing I want to bring in is, because for me, there's a sort of interdividual dharma that's arising that is simultaneously more collective and intersubjective, and also in an analogous way, intra-psychic, has to do with systems operating inside us. And questions are also moments of friction, moments of contradiction, where different systems are feeling different things. And it's an affordance of a practical possibility of creating more wholeness inside ourselves by occupying the space of the friction between different interpretive networks within us. Mm-hmm. So if we were moving to an inter-network wholeness-oriented kind of dharma, then we would be very attentive to the question and the friction and the sense that, well, this is the Savior, but also how is he forsaken by God? These are exquisite opportunities presented in a dharma of that kind. And then the third thing I'd like to throw in that complicates this a little bit, but also resonates with us, is the notion that there's a question mark about us. Mm-hmm. It's not just about God or the world or the future or the climate. It's about who we are. And that's hinted at in religion generally, right? A Messiah or a Buddha or, a sapient crow. These all make us wonder what it is to be a being like ourselves. But we've talked a lot about Nietzsche's notion of the ultra-human. Recently, I was listening to Latour talking about the fact that we aren't the anthropos in the phrase Anthropocene. Like, we don't experience ourselves as the ones who can do the thing that the Anthropocene is doing. So there's a question mark about the human condition. And it may be that many of the religious traditions that we inherit were able, in their best moments, to sustain an appreciation of the world as a mystery and the world as an uncertainty, and God as something that you can't predict. But I think now, with AI and biological technologies and all these sorts of things, we have to feel the human as an uncertainty, as a question that we have to stand in front of now.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful weaving together. I'm just wondering then, So you're right. I mean, every moment, I think cognition is self-organizing criticality, and criticality goes right back to the cross again, the critical moment, when the system, you have to destabilize the system fundamentally, almost to the point of breaking, if you want it to be able to confront the new. This is what's happening in predictive processing and cognition. And I think one of the things that's coming to the fore is a deep rapprochement. I think we're coming to the place, I've even been advancing an argument, sort of Neoplatonic in flavor, that the fundamental grammar of cognition must in some way participate in the fundamental grammar of reality, or we're in sort of an absolute skepticism of solipsism. And so I think the ability to quest into ourselves and to quest into reality are bound up together now. I think what part of what's emerging is a post-Cartesian sense of there's some deep microcosmic, macrocosmic relationship. The grammar of cognition and the grammar of being are fundamentally oneable with each other, or else we are lost in Cartesian skepticism and solipsism, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is one of the criticality moments. And then I'm trying to mesh that, because I think that resonates exactly with everything you just said, Layman. That we're talking about Christianity, but I think it's also the Cartesian framework that is undergoing this death in a profound way. And these two things are happening in a way that's very hard to step out of in a clean, that's what I find at least. It's very hard to step out of in a clean manner, enough to get an understanding of what's the relationship between these two deaths that we're witnessing, deaths and rebirths. I'm not making condemnation. Like, what's the relationship between them? And things like AI are right at the pivot point of that in a profound way. And again, given that maybe the legacy religions as they currently are not yet up to the task, what would it be? Sorry. I realized the hubris in the question as I'm posing it, but hopefully we won't anger the gods. What is it to practice this, what we're talking about? Other than talking about it, what is it to practice it in a way that reaches exactly what you said, Layman, deeply into the intra-psychic and into the interpersonal, even into the interbeing? What is it to practice that as a way? I've been sort of toying with looking at possible intersections between the two great syntheses, the Zen and Neoplatonism, and what does that look like? And what can that, not because that's going to be the answer, but could it put us in a place where the answer becomes more available to us? So that, what is it we do? I mean, I'm not saying we stop doing this, but what is it we do beyond talking about it that is needed in order for it to catch and resonates those depths that you've pointed to, Layman, and in such a way that we can deal with this twinned criticality of the breaking of the Cartesian framework and the possible death and resurrection of the Christian framework. What does that mean for us as what we do, how we live? How are we wise within that? Or how do we come to more wisdom within it?
There's one piece that I want to throw in while Layman is reflecting. I can see his mind traveling some distances here. So this is more from a theoretical or structural place to set us up for what else we might say. But Herbert Gunther, who's a very interesting scholar of especially Tibetan Buddhism, and draws on thermodynamics and Heidegger and some other sources to reinterpret Buddhist scripture. But one of the things that he discusses is that powerful spiritual practices, meditative routines, but also things like therapy or intensive educational programs, they take a system far from equilibrium. I mean, we're already complex systems that exist far from equilibrium, but they push you out to the boundaries where there's the point of possibility for bifurcation.
Yep.
And at that place where there's the possibility for bifurcation, you can either leap up to a new level of organization, or you can
Collapse.
crash the system. And so he says that basically, in all of these traditions, we have, maybe not always knowingly, but developed methods to, in a skilled way, push beings and systems to those generative edges.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of risk there, and there's a lot of possibility there. And something like Tantra is always carried with a degree of warning and concern, because as the fast method, it also pushes you to the boundaries quicker, and it can lead to disasters more easily. So it's not something to play with. But if you look back at traditional cultures, there are all kinds of ordeals that they took people through to have an undoing and a reconstitution, a death and rebirth process that was done in a controlled way. And I think in our culture, we've gotten very cautious about that, except in certain areas. And I think there's some wisdom to that, because at some levels of this, the deeper you go, the more profound the undoing can become. And I lived in Java and Bali for a long time, and I remember I lived not that far from a Tantra center, and there were some Westerners who came there who completely crashed and burned. One girl had to be helicoptered out of there because of the meltdown that she had with the intensive training that she was going through. So there's risk there that we have to take very, very seriously. But I think I wanted to throw that out there, that we do have a suite of technologies, and we're developing new ones, psychotechnologies, that take us to that far from equilibrium bifurcation point possibility. And how do we get wise about working with those things? Because taking us to those edges is taking us to the point where everything comes in question.
Could I just quickly respond to that, Layman?
Sure.
Because I think that brings up maybe the three wisdoms. There's the wisdom you have to hold in order to stoke that fire without provoking the explosion,
Mm-hmm.
which is different from the wisdom that will come through the moment of self-organizing criticality,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you need the third, which is, how do you hold those two properly together? Because the first one has to be given a kind of authority, a kind of traditional authority. People can't call that itself into question in any deep manner, because then they will blow open the container that is needed in order to provoke the profound questioning and questing that they're seeking. So there's a paradoxical tension, a tonos there between the two wisdoms, and there has to be the overarching wisdom that somehow holds them properly together. Like, so, and you get, it's like, you get these people love to, the Zen thing, you see the Buddha on the road, kill him. That's great. Now, yeah, is it? I get that. I get what they're trying to say. But like, if you took that out of the Buddhist context and just put people through some of these things, you're liable to blow them to bits and pieces, which is exactly what happens to Westerners who dip in sort of a consumerist fashion into various practices. So I just wanted to reinforce. I don't know if I'm advancing things very much, but we're bringing up a profound, I think, challenge to any answer to the previous question, which is, like, we have to be able to hold these two kinds of wisdom together. I sometimes call this, on the two poles of the sacred, the wisdom of homing people and the wisdom of taking people to the horizon of horror. And the sacred traditions always held them in a tonos together. And here's the issue to my mind. When you try to propositionalize that, you end up in contradiction that you then try to resolve in a conclusion, and then you blow apart what is needed, which is exactly this tonos, this creative tension between the wisdom of homing and the wisdom of the horizon, if I can put it that way.
Mhm.
Yeah, first of all, there's been some talk that I might be in Bali in August, Bruce, if you're thinking about revisiting Indonesia. Second of all, I think the propositional is essential here in terms of John's three wisdoms, because realization truths are not true until you realize them, right? That the propositional content is dependent upon participating. And if
Yes.
you try to take them as true before having the realization, they actually aren't true. And now you're behaving in a fictional reality. And so that can lead to destructive bifurcations. But I would throw out some suggestions for how religion might be able to enact things like this. I would suggest, as Jill Nephew does, that facilitated query could bring us in front of the question all the time, not just facilitated socially, but perhaps also as software, which could be distributed in a manner that might be able to scale up. I think people should be gathering in a sacred manner in front of the question of Gaia, in front of the question of civilizational and climatological disruption, and appreciating that. I think the inquiry meditations that we inherit from legacy religion should be privileged and brought to the fore. I think from my point of view, that spiritual practice oriented around synchronizing or connecting different kinds of systems within us could be understood as fundamental to the Dharma. As I mentioned before, bioemotional health practices are essential, because unless a body can accept the sensations involved in the questioning, then it can't really go through any of this. I think there's a social component as well, and that the priests we need going forward are ones who have to demonstrate with their manner and their speech that curiosity and ambiguity and contradiction and complexity are okay, that it's part of their social role to show that to worshipers and say that it's okay not to know, and that there's a not knowing implicit in the symbols that you have inherited. And someone has to show that to people. There has to be a renewed interest in the leading edge in religious communities, so that people are intrigued by AI, that they are intrigued by ecological transformation as something that they see as, conciliant with their religion, rather than as an obscure challenge to their religion. I think the forms of intelligence that we don't have immediate access to have to be really prioritized and discussed. The ecological and the collective and the dialogical and the subconscious and the algorithmic, right? The appreciation of the nonlinear structure of reality, which can't help but be a question to people who are coming from the rational, computationally reducible mode of consciousness. That has to be prioritized. I think altered states have to be prioritized in religion, because I think that puts us in front of, in some ways, the most profound ontological question mark is, what does it mean that I can see this in radically different ways? And I also think that ritual has to be open, unspecified. There's a beautiful passage in Syntheism by Bard and Soderquist where they talk about the temple as if you build it, they will come, right? You set up the temple not because you already know what it represents, but because it provides something like a gymnasium that you can interact with, and the understanding is on the other side. And the recent work I was doing at the second Metamodern Spirituality retreat with ritual was like that, right? We want to generate the ritual to give us the knowledge, not generate the ritual on the basis of the knowledge.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I think there's a profound future for collaborative, unspecified sacred ritual.
So I want to resonate with that, and then in a completely selfish, exploitive fashion, make a plug. This is the core of the argument I'm making in After Socrates, most of what you just articulated, all of those points about trying to capture, no, wrong word, trying to exact from the whole Socratic Neoplatonic tradition, all of those things that you said, the altered states of consciousness, the importance of ritual, the privileging of the dialogical, et cetera, all of that. And so first of all, like I said, watch After Socrates, because I think it's my offering. I'm not saying it's the conclusion. It's my offering of how to try to carefully articulate what Layman said, and I think in a convergent fashion, but in an extended argument, extended application. There's practices being taught, there's practices being demonstrated. And so I was heartened by your answer. I tried not to in any way lead it. I think your answer was completely from you. But that is the answer I've come to as well. Very much. And that's what I'm trying to place my bets on, if you can put it that way. And that's what I'm trying to do in that series. I'm trying to make the best possible case for what you just proposed that I can, the very best I can. That's the endeavor. So I wanted to thank you for your answer, because I felt deep resonance with it, and that's exactly where I'm oriented now, and trying to make a case, not in the sense of being right, but in making a case in the sense of being hopefully as helpful as I possibly can.
Yeah, I really appreciated that sharing also, and it was very resonant for me, and I'm really looking forward to that series. I don't have especially the depth of knowledge you do in the Neoplatonic traditions. I just have some elements of that, so I really want to listen in on that. And for me, it's interesting because I felt like Layman was articulating what over the last 10, 15 years we've come to consider integral post-metaphysical spirituality. Largely what we have wanted also is this kind of synthesis. And one of the things I was sitting in front of in this Rethinking Religion series, in terms of where I sit with all of that, is like you have cautioned yourself or caught yourself in a few moments, John, about am I being hubristic about this, right? And
yeah,
and in my place, my feeling is, in talking about this rethinking religion, I don't, it's not like I have any place to say, okay, now this should be the religion for everybody, right? But that it's trying to put one's finger on something that is happening in many places, and there is a kind of multipolar convergence around this kind of thing, and to give it some articulation the best that I or anyone else can, so I see this series and a lot of what you're doing on your channel, John, and Layman's broad conversations, and many others. There's this kind of I'm getting excited by this feeling of this multipolar convergence, right? And at the risk of this coming in at just like a little bit too much of a off angle, but a couple times I've had it in mind to talk about in one of our conversations, and it never comes up, so I'm just going to rudely inject it this time. No. Seriously, in thinking about in ritual, and about one of the points that Layman raised was how do we, as religious beings, not members of a religion, but how do we sit in front of our global situation and the ecological situation? And I think very early on in our conversation, I mentioned the truth mandala as an exercise where there was the rock and the stick, and you name our fear and you name our grief, and you go through this kind of ritual. There's a whole suite of actual practices that I've been working with over a number of years with different students that I've been really moved by the results of. And so I just wanted to just like name some of these things as other elements that we can put into the overall container. And one of them, it's called Council of All Beings. And it's a ritual practice in which people go out in nature, and everyone has one day to basically enter into dialogue with nature individually. And nobody is acting very collectively at first. You know, we have a little morning and evening ritual, but basically you go out and you connect with nature and you look for a resonant contact. Who do I want to speak for? Right? And you find something in nature. And then people rejoin. And if it's several days, this can go on over several days, or it could be, you know, one day or whatever. But basically, most of the rest of the conversation is from the point of view of whatever being that you've chosen to represent. And you shamanically and participatorily and dramatically bring it into the circle to speak about what its experience is, what its needs are, what its gifts are, what its challenges are. You know, you try to, as much as possible, inhabit the place of that being. And there's no humans at the gathering. And then later, at the very end, humans are brought in and they ritually interact with and engage with these beings. But it's a perspective-taking kind of exercise, and it's a way of identifying, again, more deeply with the broader living sphere. In relationship to that, there's been another practice, kind of a Tonglen practice, where you know, in the Buddhist tradition, there's a Tonglen where you breathe in the suffering, you take it into the heart, and then you breathe out well-being to others. And you take the suffering in and you breathe out that. And to me, I see Tonglen and Chi in the Tibetan tradition as very much like the Christ on the cross thing. In Tonglen, you breathe in the suffering and you breathe out the healing. And in Chi, you offer your body to be fed to all beings. Imaginally, you go through this process of dismembering yourself and feeding your body to all beings. It's a shamanic, very ancient shamanic practice. But in any event, I've done this with students too, where we go out into the world and we imaginally take ourselves to the edges of our comfort, and we go through that deep grieving process, ingesting the darkness and breathing out, and then offering ourselves as food for the world. And so it has to be handled in a particular way. But I found it very powerful and moving. And then other practices, which I won't go over too many of them, just the last suite of them are imaginal journeys, where there's a kind of a storying process that helps you identify with the broader sweep of of cosmic evolution, and kind of situates the human being in that very, very big story. And then there's one that's more grounded in the human, of walking. Often we walk backwards in a circle to go through our life, our parents' life, our grandparents' life, and go back as far as we can in human history. And it's kind of semi-narrated, and then you stop, and then you look forward from that place of beginning, and then you walk back, and then you stand again at the next Savannah point at the very end to be facing the future. So you just do an imaginal walk of basically the human journey. And to me, those have been very connecting and very profound. And, you know, a lot of people in our area of California, they now like to say, I'm from, Marin County, and this is Ohlone land. They want to identify with the people who were before. And so that fits very well into the ethos of, kind of the green ethos of where I live. But I wanted to throw those in as just some examples, and there's many more, but a lot of these things are coming from the work that reconnects, I think there's a lot of beautiful stuff that's going on that's kind of spontaneously generated rituals to connect us to Earth community and deep time and deep human history. That I think we need this kind of remembering at this fulcrum point that we're at right now.
I was convinced over the summer that connections to nature, voicing nature, ritual is integral to the cultivation of wisdom. I think intergenerational rituals, and Zach Stein has made a much better case for this than I can, but they're definitely needed to reorient us. And the Tonglen rituals, these indwelling internalization cycles, they also have to be part of any ecology of practices. And the fact that people such as yourself, putting good talent and good time and good testing into the inventio, or perhaps the reinventio of these rituals, speaks to the domains that have to be addressed by any ecology of practices that is going to offer a cultivation of wisdom that puts us into ratio religio with the situation that we are in right now. So I'm very, very interested. I'm doing as much participant observation. I'd like to talk to you more, maybe privately, Bruce, about these. I'm doing as much as I can to try and, tap into, participate in, talk to all these emerging rituals. I want to hear about them. I want to understand them. I want to get a framework, because I don't think you'd say, well, you have to do exactly, I don't hear you saying you have to do exactly this ritual or this ritual. But I think what you're saying is, but there's some deep dimension of connection that every ecology of practice has to have in it. And these are examples, perhaps even exemplary templates of how to bring those dimensions into your ecology of practices. So I think for me, it's a convergent point for me of my spirituality and my science, because as a cognitive scientist, I want to understand what are the needed dimensions. So therefore, what are the design principles for any ecology of practices that we should be recommending? But for me, paying attention to that and helping give birth to that, to me, is the ratio religio to the spiritus of the times that is emerging. So for me, it's not just a scientific act; it's a sacred act. And so I'm just deeply. I'm glad you. I didn't find that rude at all. I found that very helpful to bring those in as an example of right. And notice how you'd be very hard pressed to get those dimensions appropriately met right now in the standardized versions of the legacy religions. I'm not saying they don't have these resources, but I'm saying if you're in Toronto like I am, and you wanted to go out and find a place to practice that, you would be hard pressed. I think that's very easy to say. And so that's again where I think we are, that to me is again, the indication that we're at criticality, we're at kairos, and something is emerging. And I want to know more about this. I want to try and figure out as best as possible, what are the dimensions that should be included, right? So we know, mindfulness and movement and other things, right? Dialogical practice, but what are all the dimensions that are needed so that, and then of course there's tremendous variation within that dimensionality, but what are the dimensions that any ecology of practice should address? I think that is one of the questions that comes out of this, and we have to ask it in the right way. I was encouraged by quite a bit of this kind of asking at the Respond retreat, because what could have happened is each person could have said, this is my ecology, and this is why everybody else should be doing my ecology. And I'm not saying that was completely absent, but that was really, really significantly backgrounded. And there was a lot of attempt to get at what do all of our different practices, all of our different ecologies converge on as the proper dimensions? And I think this is the pressing question of the time. I think this is part of the central question that should be asked by those who are rethinking religion.
Yeah. I'm assuming we're at the end of the discussion, and I feel like what Bruce is adding is not a disruption, but an indicator of what the next discussion should focus on.
Yeah.
Because for me, at the retreat I recently led at Brendan Graham Dempsey's center, we focused a lot on ritual, and we focused a lot because the theme was goodness in a meta-modern sense. And one
Right.
of the exercises was imaginal dialogue with nature
Yes.
about what is goodness. And so this principle of the imaginal and how it relates to the ecological and how that relates to the sacred, I would love that to be the place we pick up next time. And John, if you get a chance, maybe you want to interrogate Greg Henriquez about his experience of those exercises. He was there with us. The other thing I would like to say at the end is, and this is because I'm about to get on a plane, is if my plane explodes in the air, I want you both to know that I love you and that this is not only fascinating, what we're discussing, I think it's essential. I think this is the necessary beginning of the theological framework for a world that could work going forward.
Love you too, Layman. And it was a great pleasure to finally meet you in person in Vermont. I hope, Bruce, I get to meet you in person. I've noticed the almost ritual realization when you meet somebody in person that you've only met with virtually. So I hope that happens soon. So take heart, Layman, that the car you're getting into to go to the airport is much more dangerous than the plane itself. And so once you get to the airport, that should calm you down. But yeah, I hope nothing happens to you, very sincerely. And I think we are all three of us articulating something that represents, we've all been at various retreats and various things. And I agree with Bruce wholeheartedly that there is something happening. And we have to be very delicate and loving about it, but we also have to keep it, acknowledging it, and keep it growing. So I look forward to that. I want to talk about the imaginal and the ecological and the sacred, and I also want to talk about maybe, we did this a bit at Response, so we can bring some of that in, Layman, but I think it bears more discussion. What are the dimensions? What are the dimensions that we should be recommending that people have in their ecology practices as having the best possible framework for giving birth to what it is we all sense is happening right now?
Big hearty yes to all of that. I also love you both. And Layman, don't explode. I want to create some psychic explosions in Sedona. So wonderful dialogue with you again, as usual, and look forward to our next meeting. Take care.
Take good care, everyone.
Take care, guys.